I have spent exactly 1,095 days building a reputation for being the person who never says no. For 3 years, I was the first car in the parking lot, and the last set of headlights to pull out onto the main road at night. My life was measured in 60-hour cycles and missed family dinners. I was the silent engine under the hood of our department, a person who had banked 0 sick days and used my vacation time to catch up on the backlogged filing that Derek, my manager, was too disorganized to handle. I didn't do it because I loved the company. I did it because I believed that if I gave everything, I would eventually be indispensable. I was a saint of productivity in a temple built of cheap cubicles. Then came Tuesday morning. I woke up at 4 a.m. not to the sound of my alarm, but to a white-hot blade of pain slicing through my lower back and radiating toward my stomach. I tried to stand up, but my legs buckled, and I ended up curled on the cold bathroom tile, shivering and covered in a thick layer of cold sweat. It was a kidney stone, though I didn't know that yet. I just knew that moving felt like dying. At 6 a.m., I managed to reach my phone. I sent Derek a text, my hands shaking so hard I could barely type. I explained the situation. I told him I was heading to the emergency room, and that I had already uploaded the final version of the 10 a.m. presentation to the shared drive. I had done the work. I had prepared the slides. All he had to do was click through them. I expected a message of concern, or at least a brief acknowledgement of my 3 years of perfect attendance. Instead, my phone buzzed 3 minutes later. Derek's reply was short, blunt, and stripped of any human empathy. He told me that if I wasn't in the conference room by 10 a.m. sharp to deliver that presentation myself, I shouldn't bother coming back at all. He said he didn't care if I was dying. He cared about the quarterly numbers. I stared at the screen through blurred vision, the pain in my side pulsing in time with the heartbeat in my ears. For a second, I actually considered trying to drive. I thought about the 3 years I had invested, but then the pain spiked again. A brutal reminder that my body was finally demanding the care I had denied it for 1,000 days. I chose my life over his deadline. I went to the hospital. While I was lying in a thin gown waiting for a morphine drip, my phone started vibrating uncontrollably on the metal side table. I thought it might be the CEO asking if I was okay. It wasn't. Derek had taken our internal Slack channel, the one visible to all 42 employees in our division, and posted a public announcement. He wrote that due to my lack of commitment and my decision to abandon the team during a critical client window, my employment was terminated effective immediately. He didn't stop there. He sent a company-wide email thread detailing my supposedly poor performance, framing my medical emergency as a premeditated act of sabotage. He was erasing 3 years of my life in 3 paragraphs of lies. He was standing in front of the board members at that very moment, likely using the slides I had stayed up until 2 a.m. finishing, while simultaneously telling everyone that I was a lazy, unreliable failure. I watched the notifications pour in from coworkers who were too shocked or too scared to reply. I sat there in the hospital bed, the medicine finally starting to dull the physical agony, but the cold burn of betrayal was just beginning to catch fire in my chest. I thought losing my job was the worst thing that could happen that day. I was wrong. Because Derek didn't just fire me, he tried to steal my legacy. The medication hadn't fully cleared my system the next morning, but the fog of the hospital was replaced by a sterile, freezing clarity. As I drove toward the office, I found myself tallying the ghosts of my past 3 years. I thought about the Thanksgiving I spent in a hotel room in Chicago fixing a server crash, while my family ate without me. I thought about the 4 separate times I had covered Derek's shifts so he could take mental health weekends at his lake house, while I stayed behind to manage the fallout of his missed deadlines. I had given this place my youth, my health, and my weekends, acting as the structural marrow that kept the company's bones from shattering. I didn't want a parade, I just wanted my personal belongings. When I reached the glass doors of the suite, I punched in my 6-digit entry code. The light flashed red. I tried again, slower this time. Red. The realization hit me like a physical blow. He hadn't even waited 24 hours to wipe my existence from the security system. I had to buzz the front desk like a stranger. When the door finally clicked open, Derek was already there, leaning against the reception mahogany with a smirk that looked like a scar. He didn't offer to talk in private. Instead, he raised his voice so the entire open-plan office could hear him. He told me that failures weren't allowed back in the building, and that he had already packed my pathetic little desk into a cardboard box. He called me replaceable. He told the team, many of whom wouldn't even meet my eyes, that I was a prime example of why you never rely on someone who lacks the grit to push through a little discomfort. He was enjoying the theater of it, playing the role of the tough love executive while I stood there with my discharge papers still in my pocket. He kicked the box toward me, the contents rattling. I knelt down and quickly realized my most valuable asset was missing. My ruggedized external hard drive. The one I had purchased with my own money and used to house 3 years of custom-coded macros, proprietary templates, and logistical frameworks I had built from scratch, wasn't there. I told him I needed my drive. Derek just laughed, crossing his arms over his chest. He told me that anything on company property belonged to the company now, and since my little toys were plugged into his network, they were his. He claimed he needed that drive to fix the mess I had left behind, effectively admitting he couldn't do the job without my intellectual property. He was stealing my physical tools to compensate for his own intellectual bankruptcy. I looked at the drive sitting on his desk behind the glass partition, the blue light blinking as it processed data. It contained every shortcut and automated script I had ever written to make him look competent. By keeping it, he wasn't just being a thief. He was committing a digital trespass that our employee handbook explicitly forbade. I felt a strange, calm vibration in my nerves. The pain in my back was gone, replaced by a predatory focus. I picked up my box, stood up straight, and looked him in the eye for the last time as an employee. He stood there laughing, telling me I'd be broke in a month. He had no idea I was already looking at the first receipt of his downfall. I sat on my living room floor surrounded by 3 years of printed bank statements, personal journals, and my digital backup of every time card I had ever submitted. When you work 60 hours a week for a man like Derek, you learn to keep your own tally, mostly because you know deep down that a man who can't remember his own login password surely can't be trusted with your livelihood. I opened my laptop and pulled up the secondary cloud drive I had synced months ago, the one Derek didn't know existed. I started a fresh spreadsheet, and for the next 6 hours, the only sound in my apartment was the aggressive clicking of my mechanical keyboard. I began with the emergency weekend requests. I cross-referenced the emails Derek sent me at 11 p.m. on Friday nights with my official payroll records. What I found was a systematic pattern of erasure. For 24 separate pay periods, my overtime hours had been manually adjusted downward by a departmental administrator login. That login belonged to Derek. He had been shaving 10 to 15 hours off my weekly total, keeping me just under the threshold that would trigger a secondary HR review. But the rabbit hole went much deeper than simple wage theft. I moved my focus to the departmental performance bonuses. In our company, if a manager brings a project in under budget on labor costs, they receive a departmental efficiency kickback, a percentage of the money saved. I pulled up the public internal filings from the last 2 years and laid them next to my actual hours worked. The discrepancy was staggering. Derek had been reporting that our projects were being completed in 40-hour weeks. He was using the automated templates and macros I had built to do the work of 3 people, then telling the board that he had optimized the workflow through his own superior management techniques. He wasn't just stealing my time. He was selling my exhaustion back to the company as his own genius. I calculated the raw numbers. By hiding my overtime, he had personally pocketed over $35,000 in efficiency bonuses that were built entirely on the back of my unpaid labor. He had effectively treated my life and my health as a personal ATM. Every late night I spent away from my friends. Every Saturday I spent staring at a glowing monitor until my eyes bled, was a direct deposit into Derek's mortgage payment. I felt a cold, oily sensation in my stomach as I realized the scale of the fraud. This wasn't just a boss being a jerk or a manager having a bad day. This was a calculated, multi-year financial predator who had identified my giving nature as a resource to be mined until it was empty. He had fired me not because I was sick, but because the kidney stone was a variable he couldn't control. I was a broken tool that threatened to expose the fact that the engine of the department was actually just one overworked person. He was robbing in broad daylight. I leaned back in my chair, the blue light of the spreadsheet reflecting in my glasses. My back still ached, and my career was supposedly in ruins, but I had something Derek didn't realize I possessed: the math. I had the exact dates, the original email timestamps, and the adjusted payroll logs. I had a paper trail that led directly from my exhaustion to his bank account. I began drafting a summary of the findings, formatting it with the same clinical precision I used for the clients he had just lost. I wasn't going to yell, and I wasn't going to beg for my job back. I was going to present an audit so undeniable that the company would have no choice but to amputate the rot he had introduced into their system. The numbers didn't lie. Derek hadn't just fired me. He had been embezzling my labor for 2 years. And then my phone rang. It was the CEO's personal assistant. The CEO's personal assistant didn't ask if I was feeling better. She didn't ask if I was still in the hospital, or if I had managed to pass the stone that had nearly incapacitated me 36 hours prior. Her voice was thin, vibrating with a frequency of pure, unadulterated panic that only occurs when a multi-million-dollar contract begins to evaporate. She told me that the CEO, Arthur, needed me on a conference bridge immediately. I looked at the clock. It was 2 p.m. on Wednesday, 28 hours since Derek had publicly executed my career on a Slack channel. I told her I would take the call, but only on my private line, and only as a private citizen. When Arthur's voice boomed through the speaker, it was a stark contrast to the silence of my apartment. He sounded like a man standing on the deck of a sinking ship. He didn't lead with an apology. He led with the wail. Our largest client, a national logistics firm that accounted for nearly 40% of our annual revenue, had walked out of the 10 a.m. presentation. Apparently, Derek had tried to present the slides I had built, but he couldn't answer a single technical question. When the client asked for a live demonstration of the automated tracking framework, the one housed on the hard drive Derek had stolen from me, Derek had fumbled, crashed the system, and then had the audacity to blame technical glitches left behind by a disgruntled former employee. The client wasn't stupid. They knew who had built the system, and they knew I wasn't in the room. They had given the company a 24-hour ultimatum. Get the architect of the project back on the line, or the contract was void. Arthur was breathing heavily into the phone, his words tripping over each other. He told me he was overruling Derek's decision. He said there had been a massive misunderstanding, and that he needed me to log in remotely and fix the server immediately. I sat on my sofa, a heating pad pressed against my lower back, sipping a glass of lukewarm water. The contrast was almost surreal. On one end of the line was a powerful man losing his grip on a fortune. On my end, there was only the quiet tick of a wall clock and the steady pulse of my own recovery. I told him, as calmly as if I were discussing the weather, that there was no misunderstanding. I told him I had been fired while lying in an ER bed. I described the text Derek sent me, the "don't bother coming back" ultimatum, and the public humiliation on the Slack channel. I let the silence hang after I finished, forcing Arthur to sit with the reality of the monster he had promoted to management. He started stammering, offering me a raise, a title change, and a corner office. He was desperate to buy back the saint who had quietly kept his company solvent for 3 years. He thought this was a simple matter of money and ego. He didn't realize that the man he was talking to wasn't the same person who had worked 60-hour weeks for a thank you that never came. I felt a strange sense of power in my refusal. For 3 years, Arthur had been a distant god, and Derek had been my tormentor. Now they were both small, frantic figures in the rearview mirror of my life. I wasn't the invisible essentialist anymore. I was the person holding the keys to the kingdom, and I had no intention of letting them back in. The desperation in Arthur's voice turned from command to plea, a sound I never thought I would hear from a man of his stature. The CEO offered me my job back on the spot. I said no. I told him, "You don't want me back. You want to look at your payroll audit first." By Thursday morning, the silence from the corporate office was deafening, but the noise on social media was just beginning to peak. Derek, true to his nature, couldn't handle the pressure of being scrutinized by the board. He was a man who lived and breathed for optics, and with the whale client slipping through his fingers, he did what every cornered narcissist does. He went on the offensive to protect his brand. He posted a 500-word manifesto on LinkedIn, the kind of self-serving drivel that usually gets buried under a sea of corporate platitudes. But this was different. He used all the trending buzzwords to mask his own incompetence, framing our entire conflict as a generational war. He wrote about the erosion of the American work ethic and the rise of quiet quitting among staff who prioritize minor health inconveniences over departmental survival. He didn't use my full name, but he didn't have to. He referenced my exact title, the timing of the abandoned presentation, and even alluded to my sudden absence as a calculated move to hold the company hostage. The entitlement was dripping from every sentence. He painted himself as the weary captain of a ship being sabotaged by a lazy, entitled crew member who didn't understand the meaning of sacrifice. He actually had the nerve to write that leadership is about showing up when it hurts, completely ignoring the fact that I had shown up for 3 years while he was taking 3-hour lunches and golf retreats. For the first few hours, the comments section was a nightmare. A fleet of mid-level managers and hustle culture influencers jumped on his bandwagon, liked his post, and shared it with captions about how loyalty is dead in the modern workforce. I watched as people who had never met me called me a snowflake and a liability. I felt that old, familiar tightness in my chest, that sense of unfairness that usually makes a person crumble. But I stayed quiet. I watched the monster build his own gallows out of public posts. The industry community was starting to turn against the vague silhouette of the person Derek had described, but then the momentum hit a brick wall. A woman named Sarah, who had been the HR director for the company until 18 months ago, entered the chat. She didn't write a long reply. She simply posted a single cryptic comment that sent a chill through the entire thread. She wrote, "Careful, Derek. Some of us still have the exit interview files from the last 3 people who held that position. If you want to talk about work ethic, perhaps we should discuss why your department has a 400% turnover rate compared to the rest of the firm." The effect was instantaneous. The hustle influencers went silent. The likes stopped climbing. Sarah wasn't just a random bystander. She was the person who had watched Derek churn through human beings like disposable filters for years. Her comment was a signal to the rest of the industry that there was a much darker story beneath the surface of Derek's alpha posturing. I sat back and refreshed the page, watching as Derek frantically tried to delete the comment, but the internet is forever. Someone had already screenshotted it. Then another former employee chimed in. Then another. The narrative was shifting from my lack of commitment to Derek's history of professional abuse. He was so blinded by his own ego that he hadn't realized he was opening a door he could never close. He thought he was shaming me into silence, but he was actually just providing a platform for every person he had ever stepped on to finally stand up. He was doubling down on his lies, posting follow-up comments about confidentiality and legal consequences, but the damage was done. He had made our private dispute a public spectacle, and in doing so, he had waived any right to a quiet exit. My phone buzzed again, not from the CEO this time, but from an attorney I had contacted an hour after Sarah's comment appeared. He told me to keep every single link and every single screenshot. Derek thought he was winning the PR war. He didn't realize that by posting those rants, he was providing the character evidence my lawyer was praying for. Friday morning arrived with the kind of stillness that usually precedes a controlled demolition. I spent the early hours finalizing what I had come to call the spreadsheet of doom. This wasn't just a list of grievances, it was a mathematical autopsy of Derek's management. For 3 years, I had been the silent architect of the department's success, and now I was going to put a price tag on every brick I had laid and every hour I had bled. I opened a fresh tab in my workbook, labeled it the Audit of Entitlement, and began the heavy lifting. I started with the raw wage theft. I had every original timestamp from the building's security badge swipes compared against my tampered payroll stubs. When you added up the shaved hours, the working lunches, that were actually client meetings, and the mandatory weekend check-ins that Derek had classified as voluntary, the number was staggering. I didn't just calculate base pay. I added the compounded interest and the state-mandated penalties for unpaid overtime. The total for the wage theft alone came to $42,000. It was a life-changing amount for me, but for Derek, it was just the cost of his departmental efficiency bonus. I didn't stop there. The next section of the spreadsheet was the most devastating: the intellectual property. I had spent hundreds of hours outside of work developing a suite of custom-coded macros and logistical templates that automated our entire supply chain reporting. These weren't company-owned assets. They were tools I had built on my personal laptop, using my personal software licenses, and brought in to make my own life easier. Derek had kept my physical hard drive, essentially stealing a proprietary system that transformed a 3-day manual audit into a 10-minute automated process. I consulted an old college friend who worked in software valuation. We estimated the market value of those tools, considering the time saving they provided to a firm of our size. The fair market value for the perpetual use of those scripts was a conservative $110,000. Derek thought he had stolen a $100 piece of hardware. He had actually committed a 6-figure trade secret theft. Then I added the succession penalty. This was the most surgical part of the audit. I held 3 niche industry certifications that were legally required for the company to bid on government-scale logistics contracts. I had paid for these certifications out of my own pocket during my first year. By firing me without a notice period or a transition plan, Derek had rendered the company non-compliant for the upcoming whale contract renewal. I calculated the cost of the company having to hire an emergency consultant at $300 an hour to fill that compliance gap, plus the legal fees for the contract breach. The total debt that Derek's ego had incurred was now climbing toward $250,000. I stared at the final sum in the bottom right cell, highlighted in a deep clinical red. It was a beautiful, terrifying number. It represented the total collapse of Derek's alpha narrative. He had framed me as a lazy expense, but the spreadsheet proved I was their greatest undervalued asset, and he was their most expensive liability. I didn't feel angry anymore. I felt like an actuary for a vengeful god. I attached the spreadsheet to a formal letter addressed directly to the board of directors, bypassing the CEO and the panicked HR department entirely. In the letter, I didn't complain about my feelings or the way Derek had mocked me in front of the team. I didn't mention the kidney stone or the hospital bed. I simply walked them through the math. I showed them exactly how much money Derek had stolen from me, and more importantly, how much money his tough love firing was going to cost the shareholders in the next fiscal quarter. I was handing them a map of the fire Derek had started, and I was holding the only bucket of water. I included a final tab that listed every instance of Derek's departmental efficiency bonuses, proving they were paid out based on fraudulent labor reporting. I was showing them that Derek hadn't just been mean to an employee. He had been stealing from the board's own pockets for 2 years. I hit send with a steady hand. There was no rush of adrenaline, just the quiet satisfaction of a job finally finished. I knew that once those numbers were seen by people who only care about the bottom line, Derek's charisma and LinkedIn rants wouldn't save him. In the world of high-level business, you can be a jerk, but you can never be a liability. Derek was now the most expensive mistake in the history of the firm. I sat back and watched the read receipt notifications start to pop up. First from the head of legal, then from the chairman of the board. I imagine the atmosphere in that office shifted from panic to a very cold, very focused type of corporate rage. They finally saw the receipts. I sent the spreadsheet to the board of directors. I didn't ask for a settlement. I just told them, Derek is your liability, not mine. That's when the suit began. The silence following my email to the board lasted exactly 48 minutes before my phone began to scream. It wasn't the CEO this time, and it wasn't HR. It was Derek. The man who had spent 3 years cultivated an image of unshakable corporate dominance was suddenly unraveling at the seams. I didn't answer the first call. I didn't answer the second. I sat at my kitchen table, opened my laptop, and initiated a call recording app, laying the phone flat on the wood. When the third call came through, I hit speaker. The voice that came out of the phone didn't belong to the alpha manager who had mocked me in the lobby. It was high-pitched, frantic, and vibrating with a jagged edge of terror. He started with the fire he had used for years, the threats. He told me that if I didn't retract that fictionalized spreadsheet immediately, he would make sure I never worked in this industry again. He claimed he had friends at every major firm in the city, and that he would personally see to it that my name was synonymous with corporate sabotage. I didn't say a word. I just let the recording software capture every syllable of his attempt to intimidate a former employee into covering up a fraud. When he realized his threats weren't eliciting a response, no tears, no apologies, no bargaining, the mask didn't just slip, it disintegrated. The tone shifted so abruptly it was almost nauseating. The monster became a desperate beggar. He began to sob, a wet, pathetic sound that lacked even the dignity of real grief. He started talking about his life outside the office, things he had never bothered to share with me while I was working 60-hour weeks for him. He told me about his adjustable-rate mortgage, the payments on his luxury SUV, and the private school tuition for his kids that was due at the end of the month. He told me that the board had called him into an emergency session and suspended him without pay pending a full forensic audit of his department. He begged me to tell them it was all a mistake. He actually suggested that I tell the board I had made a clerical error in my calculations because I was stressed from the hospital. He was asking me to lie for him, to sacrifice my own integrity and legal standing to protect the man who had fired me from a hospital bed. It was the ultimate display of entitlement. Even in his downfall, he believed my primary function was to serve as his shield. He kept saying, "We're a team, right? And I always looked out for you." I finally spoke, my voice a flat, dead calm that seemed to unnerve him more than any shouting could. I told him that I wasn't his teammate. I was his victim, and now I was his auditor. I told him that every hour he stole from me was an hour I would never get back, and every dollar he pocketed was a debt that was finally coming due. He started wailing then, a sound of pure, selfish desperation, realizing that the saint he had spent years exploiting had finally run out of patience. He started offering me money under the table, $10,000 from his personal savings if I would just make the spreadsheet go away. That was the final nail. He was now on record attempting to bribe a witness during a corporate investigation. I hung up the phone. He called back 6 times in 10 minutes. He sent a flurry of texts that shifted between, "I'm sorry," and "You're destroying a family." I watched the screen light up over and over again, a digital ghost of a man who was already professionally dead. He didn't realize that I wasn't the one destroying his life. His own greed had built the bomb, and his ego had lit the fuse. I was just the one who pointed out the smoke. I blocked his number. But he didn't stop. He showed up at my house at 9 p.m. That was his second to last mistake. The heavy thud against my front door wasn't a knock. It was the sound of a man who had lost his grip on reality. I didn't have to look through the peephole to know it was Derek. His voice, once calculated and cold in the boardroom, had devolved into a raw, ragged scream that echoed off the quiet suburban houses of my street. He was out there under the porch light, his expensive suit jacket discarded somewhere, and his tie pulled loose, looking like a manic parody of the executive he used to be. He was yelling about loyalty and betrayal, demanding that I come out and face him like a man. I stayed in the kitchen, well away from the windows, and checked my security camera feed on my phone. I saw my neighbor from across the street, a retired veteran named Miller, who didn't tolerate nonsense, stepping onto his lawn with a flashlight. A few other porch lights flickered on down the block. For 3 years, I had been the quiet neighbor who left for work at dawn and returned after dark, a ghost in my own community because of Derek's demands. Now the community was watching the monster reveal himself. Derek began kicking the base of the door, screaming that I was stealing food from his children's mouths by falsifying those records. It was the perfect validation. I didn't need to say a word to prove he was unstable. He was doing the work for me in front of a half-dozen witnesses. When the blue and red lights finally cut through the darkness of the cul-de-sac, Derek didn't even have the sense to stop. He turned his rage on the 2 officers who stepped out of the cruiser, pointing a shaking finger at my house and telling them I was a thief. The officers didn't see an executive. They saw a trespassing, belligerent man who smelled of desperation and expensive scotch. They moved with a practiced, clinical efficiency, pinning his arms behind his back while he shrieked about his connections and his salary. As they pressed him against the hood of the patrol car, a sleek black sedan pulled up behind the police cruiser. 2 men in charcoal suits stepped out, the company's senior legal counsel. I recognized the lead attorney, a man named Sterling who was known as the company's hatchet man. He didn't even glance at the spectacle Derek was making. He walked straight to the officers, handed them a document, and then turned his attention to Derek's car, which was idling haphazardly in the middle of the street. Sterling served Derek with a formal cease and desist, and a notice of immediate termination for cause right there on the pavement. The irony was a cold, sharp blade. Derek had fired me via Slack, and now he was being served his own professional death warrant while handcuffed in the back of a squad car. The neighbors stood on their lawns, their phones out, recording the total collapse of the man who thought he was untouchable. My phone buzzed with a final notification from the company's secure server. The board had officially authorized a full internal lawsuit against Derek for gross negligence and financial malfeasance. The saint was no longer the target. I was the primary evidence. As the police escorted him away, the lead lawyer for the company stepped out of his car. He didn't look at Derek. He looked at me and said, "We're suing him. And we need your..." The legal proceedings that followed weren't a trial so much as they were a clinical extraction of everything Derek owned. Once the board of directors realized the scale of the damage, the corporate gloves didn't just come off, they were replaced with brass knuckles. The whale client, true to their word, officially pulled their $10 million contract 48 hours after the door scene. They cited a lack of institutional stability and the loss of the primary architect, me, as a breach of the confidence clause in our agreement. To a company our size, losing $10 million isn't just a bad quarter. It is a structural catastrophe. The company didn't just fire Derek. They unleashed a litigation team that specialized in turning people into cautionary tales. They sued him for gross negligence and tortious interference, arguing that his ego-driven decision to fire me while I was incapacitated was a direct violation of his fiduciary duty to the shareholders. Because he had manually tampered with my payroll records, they were able to pierce the corporate veil that usually protects managers from personal liability. They went after his assets. I watched the updates through the formal depositions and the hushed whispers of my former colleagues who were now eager to be my friend again. Derek's luxury SUV was the first thing to go, repossessed when he couldn't make the payments after his accounts were frozen by a court order. Then came the house, the one with the adjustable rate mortgage he had begged me to help him save. It went on the market as a distress sale, a monument to a man who thought he could steal time and sell it as his own. His reputation in the industry was radioactive. No firm would touch a man who had been sued by his own employer for fraud and lost a flagship client in the process. He had gone from a hustle culture icon on LinkedIn to a living punchline in every boardroom in the city. While Derek was drowning in the fallout of his own making, my life took a very different turn. The company realized that without my proprietary scripts and certifications, they couldn't even fulfill the minor contracts they had left. They didn't just want me back, they needed me. I sat down with Sterling, the hatchet man lawyer, and the CEO. I didn't accept their offer of a staff position. Instead, I negotiated a massive settlement for the back wages and the intellectual property theft Derek had committed. On top of that, I signed a 6-month independent consulting contract at 4 times my previous hourly rate. I was no longer the giving saint who sacrificed his health for a cubicle. I was a specialized asset with a fee schedule that reflected my worth. The financial audit I had performed in my living room became the basis for a settlement that paid off my mortgage and funded a year-long sabbatical I planned to take once the transition was over. I spent those 6 months cleaning up the mess Derek had left behind. Every time I opened a file he had touched, I found more evidence of his incompetence. Half-finished reports, plagiarized data, and notes to himself about how to further squeeze the staff for bonuses. I erased his influence from the server, line by line, until the department functioned with a quiet, automated grace that didn't require anyone to work 60 hours a week. The toxic culture he had cultivated withered without his presence, replaced by a team that finally felt safe enough to take a sick day without fear of execution. It was the total professional vindication I had dreamed of while lying in that hospital bed. The contrast was complete. The monster was stripped of his status, his wealth, and his voice, while the invisible essentialist was finally seen. I finished my contract on a Friday afternoon, the same day Derek's final appeal was denied. I walked out of that building for the last time with my head held high and a check in my pocket that ensured I would never have to work for a man like him again. Derek is now working a retail job in the same mall where I take my new clients for lunch. But the best part? It's what I found out about the sick day that started it all. The mall is a quiet place on a Tuesday afternoon, which is exactly why I like to host my consulting clients there. It provides a certain poetic symmetry to my life. As I sat in the glass-walled cafe, finalizing a contract for a new logistics firm, I saw him. Derek was folding sweaters in a department store window across the atrium. He looked smaller, his shoulders hunched in a way they never were when he was wearing a $4,000 suit. He was no longer the man who could end a career with a single Slack message. He was just a man who had to ask for permission to go on a lunch break. Seeing him didn't make me feel angry. It made me feel nothing at all. I had learned the hardest lesson of the corporate world. Loyalty is a two-way street, but my paper trail is a one-way bridge to freedom. If you don't track your own value, you're just handing someone else the pen to write your story. I decided long ago that I would never let another person own my time or my health. My new firm is built on that principle. I work 30 hours a week, charge triple the industry standard, and I haven't missed a family dinner in a year. But there was one final piece of the audit that needed to be balanced. A month after Derek was served his final court papers, I reached out to his former administrative assistant, Maya. She was the one who had quietly forwarded me the internal payroll logs when she saw the spreadsheet I was building. She had risked her own job to help me prove the fraud. I didn't just thank her. I hired her as my head of operations. I gave her a 50% raise on her first day, along with a remote work contract and a health plan that actually covers the unexpected. In our office, sick days aren't a fireable offense, they're a human right. As for Derek, I sometimes wonder if he thinks about that 10 a.m. presentation while he's tagging merchandise. I wonder if he realizes that the family mistake he tried to erase ended up being the only person who actually knew how to keep his world from falling apart. Would you have taken the settlement, or gone for the full collapse? Let me know in the comments. Next time, my Emile tried to sell my house while I was on vacation, so I sold her car.